Dirty hands means clean theology. Can you dig it? What's going on, all my local guys and gals and long distance pals?
We're back
We're back without Ben.
without Ben. It's sad.
Our guest today, I think, shamed him out.
He's got a better beard.
He knew he couldn't compete, so he's like, guys, I'm sitting this one out.
Well, today with us we have Dr. Judd Burton, the president, owner, the CEO of the School of Biblical Anthropology. Thanks for being on with us again today, Judd.
Happy to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, it's been a while, and I know last I'd heard that you and Dr. Aaron Judkins were gearing up for a Fringe Pop 321.
Yes, that's the plan, is to take over. That was kind of a torch that the late Dr. Heiser passed on to the both of us, and so we're kind of spitballing potential episodes and guests right now. We've got enough content that Mike recorded a couple of years ago to kind of last us through the year. So it's probably going to be the beginning of next year when we start doing just episodes with he and I. But we're really excited about that.
Yeah, I spoke to Aaron on my other show, the Prometheus Lens, and we was talking about it. And he said he was really excited too to work with you and get started on that.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun.
Well, I know this is how you say not to tread old tires, and but I've heard you talk about Halloween on some other podcasts, and I was wanting to pick your brain and let you explain that to some of our listeners, and maybe go down some rabbit trails that haven't been went down yet with you. Well, because it is the season. The leaves are starting to change. Things are starting to die, and all the witches and the covens are all gearing up for the thinning of the veil, so to speak. So I found no one better to have this conversation with than you.
And I think that's a big thing that we're talking about this time of year as a Christian community. You know, there's the Christian people across the country are very divided on what Halloween is and should you celebrate it, should you not celebrate it. And then really, I think it's important that we look at its roots. We look where it came from. And the idea, as far back as the Kelts, just want to kind of go through the basic history of Halloween and then kind of get to where we are right now with a couple things. And I'd love to talk to you a little bit about that idea of the thinning of the veil. It's something we've been looking at a little bit lately as well, too. So,
sure.
But as far as in my experience from all the research of this stuff is the holiday, the Celtic holiday of Samhain, or it's pronounced that way, but it looks like Samhain when you look at that. So, Judd, can you kind of give us a breakdown of where all this idea started from?
Sure. Well, Halloween, that has become such an ensconcement in the popular American calendar, is a direct descendant of as you mentioned, the Celtic festival of Samhain, which was essentially the Celtic New Year, branching that night between October the 31st and the day of November the 1st. This is really just one iteration of a festival, what is technically a festival of the dead or a festival of the ancestors, a time when it was thought that communication with those ancestors was best facilitated when the veil, as it were, between this world and the spiritual world was the thinnest, and such communications were easiest. But ancient though the festival of Samhain is, there are certainly even more ancient precedents for these festivals of the dead, the festivals of the gods, which coincidentally generally fell sometime in the fall between August and November. Even going back to the ancient Near East, there were certainly festivals of the dead that the Canaanites and Phoenicians celebrated, that the Mesopotamian people celebrated. The Romans had Pomona in the fall, which was kind of a harvest festival, but also an homage to ancestors that had passed along, which was really a key feature of ancient Roman society. It was reverence for the dead. There were a number of festivals that the Romans had throughout the course of their calendrical year that gave homage to the dead. Another one was the Parentalia that took place in February. But generally, these festivals of the dead occurred during the course of the latter part of the year, during the fall when the harvest was being brought in. And honoring one's ancestors might seem innocuous enough on the surface. I mean, we kind of do the same thing, but it's the nefarious nature of the spirits that were placated and communicated with during this time of the year that make Samhain and by proxy Halloween such a deadly sort of flirtation, if you will, spiritual flirtation, because there are prohibitions against such practices in the Bible. That's why the penalties for this kind of thing, necromancy, in particularly in the Old Testament, carried with it, capital punishment, because of the dangers, implicit in that. Hey guys, I'm gonna stop for a second. I've got something in my eye that I've got to get out.
Okay, yeah, that's
You're
fine.
good.
I was about to ask
Yeah.
if you was all right. I seen you rubbing on it there.
Yeah, hold on just a second. Okay, I'll pick up basically where I left off. But there are all kinds of biblical intersections here that should give people pause about taking part in Halloween. Of course, everybody really has to make their own decision. They have to really discern and pray about that sort of thing. But it's not just that we're obeying New Testament admonishments about avoiding the very appearance of evil, but these are ancient practices, the communication with the dead, that, as I pointed out a moment ago, carried with them a hefty fine, not because Yahweh was an overbearing, patriarchal God, but because there were dangers in consulting not just the human dead, but especially the other things that paraded around as the human dead, namely the Rephaim, who are not only linguistically linked with the Rabbah in Mesopotamian mythology, who occupied the dead ancestor kings, the dead god kings that occupied the abyss, the watery abyss, the underworld, but also the Rapha in Ugaritic tradition, who also were venerated. We actually have pretty detailed records in the Ugaritic material about the Phoenicians' rites that were paid to these dead ancestor kings, dead god kings. And along with a list of other things, these were prohibitions that were laid out by God to avoid because of the explicitly demonic nature of the entities that were being trafficked with, essentially. But outside of the Old Testament, and this is based on work that I've done recently on Paneas, in trying to nail down the timing of Jesus's arrival at Caesarea Philippi. and the events leading up to the Transfiguration. I had earlier kind of pinned down generally, because scholars had known for quite some time, or I should say that the consensus had been that Jesus had arrived at Caesarea Philippi during the winter before his death. And again, it dawned on me that you had January and February to deal with as well. And so I began to look at February, and it dawned on me that the Lupercalia, which was the festival to Pan, would make a lot of sense if Jesus is firing a shot over the bow of the enemy, so to speak. That would be good timing. But there's another festival taking place against the backdrop of the Lupercalia, and that is the Parentalia, which is this week and a half long festival, a series of festivals where the Romans honored dead ancestors. And on the last day of the Parentalia, which I believe now coincides with the Transfiguration, the Greco-Roman culture celebrated this last day of the Parentalia as probably the most ominous of those days, because it was thought that the most wicked and nefarious of those spirits were to be placated on that day. So it's a perfect juxtaposition of the Transfiguration and all that that represents. And so there are these, there are glaring examples in the Old Testament of why we shouldn't engage in necromancy, and there are certainly many prescriptions against it in the New Testament as well. Not only in Jesus' ministry, but also the apostles that wrote letters echoed, that concourse with the dead that the pagans took part in.
Now, quick question, Judd. You were saying about the Parentalia. Is that around that same time of year that we're talking about, like early winter or late fall?
Well, the Parentalia is actually on the Roman calendar is in February.
Oh, okay.
But it evokes a similar kind of theme and practice. But most of these festivals of the dead took place, just statistically, took place somewhere between August and November.
So it makes sense to me that it's kind of in the fall like that, because and the way that I've always understood it was it's the end of life into death as we go in from autumn into winter. You're seeing the dying out of the leaves, the crops are being harvested, and all of a sudden you have the barren trees and things like this. So you're seeing a transition of, exact opposite of like the spring equinox, when we start seeing all of a sudden death back to life, right? So is that the core reason why those holidays were around that time, or why did they believe that the veil was so thin at that time?
Well, it's that, and there's something that that the late anthropologist Sir James Frazer wrote in his seminal volume, the Golden Bough, which I recommend people check out. It's a little dated, but it still serves as one of the hallmark works on magic and comparative religion. And Frazer devoted an entire section of this multi-volume work on the dying and resurrecting God, the corn deity, as he called it, that you find in the form of gods like Osiris in Egypt,
Mithras,
and Mithras, exactly, and another one might Melkart or Adonis in Phoenician mythology. They all represent this same kind of thing, which ultimately is a kind of mockery of Jesus' sacrifice. That Jesus is as C.S. Lewis put it, he's the myth that's true. So he is the dying and resurrected God, on all these other things, just like in the demonic realm, are a counterfeit of the original. It's flipped on its head, so to speak. But this is a time when a lot of those deities were also honored, that had to do with the agricultural cycle, the dying and the rebirth of the year, and that's why so many of these agrarian calendars started their new year in the fall, is because their concept of sacred time was reflective of what they thought the gods were doing throughout the course of that year. And so it's all kind of snowballed together. There's a lot of overlap between that and the concept of communicating with the dead.
But see, I spoke with Luis Marcos, and I don't know if you're familiar with his book, but it was the Myth Made Fact, and he took that quote from Lewis, and me and him got to talking, and I told him, I said, I always seen that, how Scripture says what the devil intends for good or for evil, that God turns for good for those who love Him.
Mm-hmm.
I asked him, I said, I've always kind of seen when people talked about, Mithras and Adonis and Osiris, even if the devil meant it as a perversion, God spun it as a good thing, as basically like a preconditioning.
Mm-hmm.
Because, if you think that God didn't speak to his entire creation,
Mm-hmm.
he only chose to reveal himself to the Jews without even any kind of preconditioning. When these Gentiles heard this story, it would be almost like they were being invaded by a foreign god.
Mm-hmm.
So at least with this, preconditioning that they had, it was a familiar story to them, and they were more prone to accept and believe it.
Right. And I'm not a Jungian by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think that in a lot of ways we're hardwired, we're created to think about these kinds of things. It's just that God, Yahweh, had a plan from the beginning, and those members of his heavenly host that rebelled against him, that led this coup against him, knew part of that plan, and so they corrupted it, in the millennia leading up to it. Now, we could do an entire other show on just the mythic themes that have been corrupted, that were only realized in reality by Jesus Christ. But it's almost like another example would be like the demons had, and the fallen Elohim as well, they didn't have a complete picture, but they had a better foresight of things down the road than we did. And so they were able to position themselves in the cultures of the world and to engineer those cultures for their own ends, and even to geographically situate themselves in the ancient Near East. They didn't exactly know. That's why so many of the giant tribes early on were in the prehistoric and the ancient Near East. They didn't know exactly where the Messiah was going to show up, but they had this general idea about it. And the spirits of these, specifically the Rephaim, are really at the heart of the matter of the subject that we're talking about today.
Agreed.
I got one more question. That's, I guess, it's still on the same track. I promise I'm not going to jump around too much.
That's
But
okay.
looking into these, and we see these festivals, and we see them all around the world. We talked about Samhain from the Celtic culture. Obviously there's All Hallows Eve or Halloween here.
Mhm.
All Saints Day.
Well, we look at was it? I mean, literally, there's festivals around the world. The Oban Festival, the Festival of Wandering Spirits in Japan,
Uh-huh.
the Qing
Which is
Ming
Taoist or
in
Shinto.
and then there's, I can't even pronounce this one in Taiwan. It's like Zhonghua, but it's the Hungry Ghost Festival.
Uh-huh.
And then the Jia Jatra in Nepal, and it's you're celebrating. It's always this veneration of the dead, and you're seeing it in all these different cultures around the world, and it's a very similar thing. And it's usually, like you said, around that time of year, I'm seeing all these festivals happen like around the very end of August through the end of September, or the end of October, beginning of November, like November 1st. It's that harvest time. How is all this connected? Where does it come from that each culture around the world has a similar belief, a similar veneration of the dead, that in a pagan festival for this?
Well, as I see it, people have two alternatives. There's the archetypal, which is more kind of the scholastic academic explanation, is that there are these mythic archetypes that express themselves in similar ways throughout different cultures, simply because that's how humans think. But I think it goes beyond that to the second option, because the other option is that, yes, God, I think, hardwired us to believe a certain way, to believe in certain things, because that's all wrapped up in our spiritual fulfillment as well. But these corrupting influences, these gods of the nations, as it were, in keeping with the divine council worldview, the Deuteronomy 32, take on all of this, is that they ensconce themselves in places where they could affect and engineer these different cultures, and revealed themselves as the overlords of these various, cultures. And those systems that they set up were carried on by either the gods of the nations that remained in place, or by their progeny and later generations of tribes of giants. So really, I think those are the two options at the end of the day that certainly a general audience would have to consider, and secondly, in particular, a believing Christian audience would need to take into account that the reason that mythologies around the world and the festivals that are associated with them, because that's really what festivals and ritual are, is they're the almost theatrical reenactment of mythologies. So said anthropologist Victor Turner, who was also very, very keen, very insightful in these kinds of things. But that's really why we see a lot of similarities in the timing of these festivals, in the themes of these festivals of the dead, is because a lot of these people around the world, the vast majority of them, are getting different slight variations on a theme, culturally nuanced for a particular society, as revealed by these gods of the nations and their later projects.
I think you see that too. I think I agree with you 100%. I think you see that with, look at the different carvings on the walls of like the Anunnaki and different around, and you go into South America and you see these same, carrying the little hand bags or whatever those things are supposed to be. They have the same look, and how these cultures would have communicated. If we listen to the mainstream, they would tell us they never ever would have been in communication. There's no way they could have been, but obviously they're seeing something similar. Something's telling them these things to erect these megaliths to these gods that they're calling them these gods, and they're so similar from culture to culture to culture that they had to have that influence. It just makes a lot of sense to me.
Right.
Well, I wanted to talk to you more specifically about a lot of the lore surrounding this festival, specifically with the Druids. Here, on different podcasts and blogs and stuff, and you hear about, just like, for example, bobbing for apples. Bobbing for apples was when the Druids would go and kidnap children and boil a cauldron with apples in it, and told the children they had to stick their face in and grab an apple if they wanted to avoid being sacrificed, or building these huge wicker men and putting people in it and burning them alive. Just some of these the myth and the lore surrounding the Druids and these human sacrifices and things like that. I'm just wondering if maybe you could elaborate on some of those and
Sure.
separate fact from fiction.
Well, what we know about the Celts is largely taken from Greek and Roman sources, and of course the Celts as a kind of general designation for Caucasian peoples in Northern and Western Europe. And we're, of course, ethnically it's a little more complicated, but this general culture of the Celts, what we know about them comes largely from the people that gradually conquered them. So the Greeks and Romans first, and then of course there were later peoples that were brought about as well during the Dark Ages and late antiquity. But we do get these little artifacts within the text of these Greek and Roman historians that do corroborate some of what the Celts in general and the Druids specifically were up to. And you mentioned the Wicker Man sacrifice, which is recorded in a number of occasions. I think not the least of which is Julius Caesar's Gallic commentaries on his conquest of Gaul. But the Celts themselves, the only alphabet that they had was the Ogham alphabet, and it was used extremely sparingly and only by the Druids. The Druids didn't really write anything down because they thought that writing something down somehow demeaned it. They were largely an oral culture, and they transmitted vast amounts of complicated information and a very complicated educational regimen that they went through, from Ovid to Bard to Druid. But a lot of the emblems and practices that survive in modern Halloween celebrations are kind of watered down versions of the original. The jack-o'-lantern is probably the most prolific symbol of Halloween in America. And most of us growing up probably carved pumpkins here and there. This was actually a practice that was descended from not carving pumpkins, but carving turnips with these little faces. And the Celts would put a coal, a hot ember, inside the turnip, because you're doing more fine work with the turnip. You got a little more room to work with than a pumpkin. That's just the American version of that practice. But these, of course, would be set outside. In some instances, they were to ward the Druids off, not necessarily ward them off, but signify that the proper rites had been followed by families, so that a child sacrifice or some kind of human sacrifice would not be necessary. The other interpretation is that they signified, in fact, where Druids were supposed to stop to pick up sacrificial victims that were dispatched in any number of ways, not excluding the Wicker Man practices. But that's probably one of the more prolific images and rites that survived in a kind of watered down version. Another is the actual dressing up. We associate today, at least the commercial end of Halloween, we associate with people and kids in particular dressing up as all kinds of ghastly things, from the traditional ghosts to vampires and werewolves and mummies and witches and zombies, even their favorite superheroes or what have you. It just sort of runs the gamut. But this is a practice that is probably probably goes back to the oldest foundations of Druidic religion, before they began to conceptualize their gods as anthropomorphic. Um, and so there's a kind of totemistic element to it. A totem is just an animal spirit, and in a number of the sort of raucous, uh, almost carnival type rites that were observed by the Celts, at Samhain, they would don these animal masks, um, sort of take on the not just the natural and sort of behavioral aspects of an animal, but any supernatural uh, qualities that were assigned to particular animals. Um, to a lesser extent, although it's not associated with Samhain or Halloween, it's in the Nordic world. By way of illustration, the berserkers in Norse culture they were called berserkers because they would actually wear bear skins. That's what
Yeah.
it means in German, and in some cases wolf pelts. So again, the practices that we see today, which have been largely, commercialized, although they're still, arguably spiritually very dangerous, stem from these older, uh, very crucial components of rites in the I would argue not just the ancient world but the prehistoric world as well. When humanity's exposure to these fallen Elohim and their progeny, the giants, was still very fresh.
With the trick or treat, now is that associated with that too, with the Druids, or is that just something that's been Americanized?
Well, no, there again, that's sort of tied up with the jack-o'-lantern practices. As a kind of token, if you've done the proper rites to avoid, you know, having members of your family taken into that sort of sacrificial raffle. But what it grew into, was a kind of uh, uh, sanctioned mischief. We typically don't think about that in societies that are based on law and order, but it happened with some frequency, uh, probably with frequency that would alarm people, even in the Christian West. Um, I mentioned the Festival of Carnival that happened in February, which is probably a descendant of the Lupercal, on the Roman calendar, but it and it's preserved in festivals today, even like Mardi Gras. But it was this raucous uh, festival where, uh, you know, not to put it too bluntly, but such pornographic imagery was paraded, down the thoroughfares of cities, and people were sort of given license to be given over to, this kind of riotous debauchery. Um, and so the that too is sort of wrapped up in the trick or treat idea, but it again, over the centuries, it got watered down. Um, when Halloween arrives on American shores, in really in the 17th and 18th century, it's largely a mainstay of the Virginia colony and the colonies that were associated with the Anglican Church and later Catholic Church, like the colony of Maryland. But in the Puritan northern colonies, it was eschewed because those were all based on Reformation theology. Those were Protestants. And so Halloween and even things like Christmas were kind of eschewed because they were associated with the Catholic Church. Of course, by this time, the Catholic Church had sort of christened the festival of Samhain, and it became Halloween, or All Hallows Eve. But when it arrives to the shores, it takes a couple of centuries for even the sort of watered down, banal versions of those practices that arrive in the States in the form of colonies, rather in the form of, parties and games and things like that and dressing up. It's really not until the 19th century where we see this, in the middle of the 19th century, there's a huge influx of Irish and German immigrants. And the Irish bring with them their Samhain traditions that have been largely sort of christened by the Catholic Church. But the trick or treat traditions turn into an excuse for the kind of license in a way that you saw in the Carnival Festival with all of its debauchery, except it's mischief in the form of I'm not just talking about playing a trick on somebody, not just playing a trick on somebody, but vandalism and arson and just theft, all manner of crimes literally committed. So much so that in the beginning of the 20th century, there was a push to promote which I suspect is also demonic at its heart, was a push, a popular social push to get kids more involved and to kind of blunt the criminal aspects of Halloween.
That was Elizabeth Crabs was in Newaka, Kansas.
Yes.
Yeah, I had read up on that. I never knew that. That blew my mind. It was like basically it was like the 1920s to the 1950s. You seen children being incorporated in these large parties because of this woman Elizabeth Crabs in Kansas. It was in 1913. She threw the first like huge block party, and basically the kids were destroying the gardens and vandalizing, doing all these things. So she just thought she could wear them out, and it didn't work the first year. So the second year, she doubled down, and all the crime and the mischief seemed to settle down. So it just kind of spread from there. I thought that was pretty wild.
Yeah, it is. Something that on the surface seems to be well intentioned, and with all that's demonic about Halloween being promoted to children, you can see the supernatural, chess game going on kind of behind that, kind of the demonic stratagem behind it. And that's often, how it happens. It seems innocuous on the surface, much like many people would argue about Halloween today. But underpinning the festival itself are all of these very archaic and in fact demonic elements.
Now, a quick question on that, and like I said, not to stray too far off topic, but I kind of feel that the church a lot of times would attempt to, I guess, suppress those pagan traditions by trying to insert their own holidays or trying to put their own traditions in place. I mean, we can look at that with Christmas, right? Jesus was not born on December 25th. We know that. We are pretty sure it was sometime in September now, by looking at everything. So the church puts his birth there to kind of coincide with the winter solstice and the pagan festivals that kind of go along with that. We see traditions in Easter with, an Easter egg, right? We're looking again at some of these pagan traditions that come around with, the church uses it. Oh, it's new life. It's Jesus' resurrection, but that's not where some of these other things originally, populated. But it's a fine line because you're trying to fight a demonic thing, almost using their own game at some point, if that makes sense.
Well, Christmas is a whole other discussion, as is.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go.
As is Easter, but and we can certainly talk about that around those holidays if you want to. But with Halloween, one of the things you have to understand about church history is that as public paganism began to descend into the shadows, basically beginning with the Edict of Milan under Constantine, when Christianity gained sanction, it would eventually become the official religion of the Roman Empire. But when the church began to send missionaries into largely parts of Europe, but remote parts of the known world, the Western world at the time, the sort of standing order was to canonize or christen sacred space and sacred time. In other words, for example, if you've got missionaries that are ending up in the Germanic lands and they're sacred groves of oak trees dedicated to, you know, Odin, um, the church hierarchy would tell the missionaries, look, don't chop the grove down because the people are already used to gathering there for their ceremonies. Build a church there. The same thing with sacred time, you know, in the case of like Halloween that we're talking about tonight. They would have said, well, don't throw all of those practices out. Let's make instead of homage to dead ancestors and dead ancestor gods, let's remember our, you know, family members that have passed on. And we'll call it All Hallows Eve, because there are saints, and another reason was that there were lots of saints that didn't have their own day, and so this just kind of became a catch-all, and that's where the word Halloween comes from. All Hallows Eve, All Saints Day, the next day. But yeah, this syncretism was kind of the, you know, whether it was the fledgling Roman Catholic Church or the Eastern Orthodox Church, they had a very similar approach to, you know, these missionaries that they sent out. You know, they would basically take the old agrarian festivals and put a Christian, you know, overlay on them. So that's why, you know, you mentioned a couple of other festivals on the Christian calendar of the year. That's why you see a lot of these, is this sort of Christian gloss is given to them in order uh, to try and bring pagans into the fold and become not ethnophanes, as the Eastern Christians would call them. They're basically unbaptized or in a kind of catechism, being educated in the Bible and theology, but still be able to retain some of those cultural practices. And unfortunately, there are negative and demonic things that were associated with those practices. And what ended up happening is they provided a kind of vehicle for the conveyance or perseverance of those practices.
That's
Because a lot of them show up in, you know, I mentioned public paganism a moment ago. Because paganism went underground, it didn't disappear. You know, the old gods just became things like fairies and spirits and elves and gnomes and things like that to a lot of the peoples of Europe, and they called them hearth religions because people would practice, you know, they might be regular churchgoers, but they would still maintain these customs in their home around the fireplace. That's why they were called hearth religions. And in fact, the word heathen is taken from that because of these practices that were done around the fireplace. And in it, you know, depending on how long they went on, some families might not even remember why they had these little statuettes or whatever uh, on their fireplace mantle, or, you know, why they cultivated certain herbs during certain phases of the moon or something like that. And for people who are interested in this, there are historians like uh, Carla Ginsburg and what's the guy's name? Uh, uh, he wrote a book called Binding Passions. This other guy that I'm trying to think of. Guido Ruggiero, excellent microhistorical studies on these kinds of practices if people are interested in learning more.
It seems like at the root of that, you see this, it's almost like a massive, spiritual warfare that we're not even seeing. So we have these pagan holidays that are put in place, in some cases thousands of years ago. And then we're seeing, we try to curb it for the better. It's a back and forth. But I think Vicky Joy was the one that told us, and it's one of the things that's always stuck with me. She goes, you don't always have to leave the door open. Sometimes your window's just cracked just enough for something to creep in.
Yeah.
And that spiritual warfare, I think, is all around us, and we see it in so many different ways. And at the same time, sometimes the scariest ones are the ones that we don't know are affecting us, right? We don't know that that we're letting things in, that things are affecting us in a negative way, but we just accept them. And I think that that's a huge part in our culture today you could say that about Halloween. We can say that about a lot of different things in our culture today. But I think that, every time we give something an inch, they want 2 more inches. They're just going to keep taking more and more and more. But every time that the church or someone does something, if it was Miss Krabs who did something with the best intent, she strikes back, and then they strike back twice as hard. It's just one of those things that I think we see so much in our society today. And it's so hard because I don't think most people see the underlying, how much of this that we've accepted, how much of this stuff that's become commonplace to us, how much of this is just, it's part of us now.
Well, it's a desensitization, and it's almost like the frog in the boiling water. You don't turn the water up to extreme heat on the frog because the frog will jump out. You slowly turn it up, and it doesn't want to leave because it's nice and warm. The next thing you know, they're boiled. And it's like these customs and these traditions of men, like us. We grew up, trick-or-treating and dressing up for Halloween. We thought it was fun. Of course, we didn't know all the underlining stuff and histories behind it. And then when you do find out about these things, it's natural that you're like, I've done this for 30 something years, it's harmless. And I love how Tom Dunn said a few weeks ago, he said, what you can't crucify through the blood, men tends to justify.
Yeah. That's true. I mean, this goes back to what I was talking about earlier with the gods of the nations, the fallen Elohim and their progeny engineering culture for their own ends. I wrote this paper a couple of years ago called "The War of the Words," where I traced words for king and ruler in Indo-European languages, which those words share phonetic and morphemic similarity. But I traced them all the way back to the roots for words like Rabbah and Rephaim and Rappa, because you get words like Rex in Latin and Roy in Spanish, Ray in Spanish, Gree in Gaelic, Rajan in Sanskrit, in Araha and Tagalog in the Philippines. Literally dozens upon dozens of words with that initial R vowel morpheme that seem to stem from this concept of these underworld gods. And that's just one word.
And that's again across so many cultures across the world, which again shows that connection.
Yeah, because out of Proto-Indo-European sprang 90% plus of the languages spoken in the Old World, on the continents of Europe and Asia. And the more that I study Proto-Indo-European and Proto-Semitic, and in particular, Eastern and Central Turkey, ancient Anatolia, there's a lot going on here, linguistically and culturally in prehistory and early antiquity that I think is going to revolutionize biblical studies in the next 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, because it was just a melting pot. You're right there in the middle of the Mediterranean, and you had all these different cultures, and just, I mean, it really was. It was like the melting pot of the world back then.
Oh, yeah, but I'm talking about ground zero, and not necessarily Genesis 6 ground zero, but it's the same time frame. We tend to think of middle and lower Mesopotamia, where Sumeria and Babylon and Akkadian civilization, and then later Assyrian Amorite civilization was. We tend to think of that as where civilization sprung from, but we're having to take those dates millennia back, and we're finding that the wellspring of civilization, city-state dwelling, is actually more to be found in eastern and central Turkey, ancient Anatolia.
Yeah, go back.
Which is the southern end, particularly areas like the Armenian highlands and the mountains of Ararat in far eastern Turkey. That's the southern end of the Proto-Indo-European heartland. So there's a lot of ideological, cultural, and linguistic exchange going on there, and mixed in with all of this is artifactual evidence at places like you mentioned, Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, even in more southerly Natufian sites like Tel Caramel, this cult of the dead, which seems to be a fundamental aspect of early human religion.
Or you look back and you think, how many times did God bring up the fact, do not sacrifice your kids to Molech or things of this nature? We see it throughout the Old Testament. I mean, time and time again. And it's one of those things, we talked about that before. The same thing when we talk, Deuteronomy is talking about the, are calling upon the dead, and, do not, practice necromancy, do not, work with mediums. And God says this countless times. And we've talked about this before and said, if it didn't work, why would God warn us so many times? He's not warning us because it doesn't work. He's warning us because we don't know what we're calling on.
Somebody did it. And then I love how too in Deuteronomy it said they sacrificed to demons and not gods.
Yeah, to gods that their fathers did not know.
Yeah, that had come recently.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. That just blows me away.
Well, Judd, I know it's getting close time for you to go, brother. I don't want to hold you up, but
Judd, you want to give everybody a little plug of where they can find your books, any podcasts, anything you have upcoming?
Yeah, people can check my stuff out at burtonbeyond.net. If I teach coursework on this stuff, the one that's really hot right now is preternatural morphology, where I go through a biblical analysis of things like vampires and werewolves and demons and zombies, and tie them back to the pre-flood world. And biblical demonology, also a pertinent topic. And if people want to check those courses out and take them, you can register anytime. And you can find that at burtonbeyond.net/IBA. And that'll take you to informational courses. I've got, as I pointed out, I've got some books in the works. Dr. Aaron Judkins and I are finishing up the Göbekli Tepe and the Bible book. Doug Van Dorn and I are working on a book on the Serpent Mound of Bashan. And my long-awaited book, The Van Helsing Way, should be coming out towards the end of this month to kind of coincide with, I think it's a pretty timely release, actually.
Yeah.
I don't know, not just in terms of the year, but also just in terms of the general times we live in. People need to be more aware of this.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much, Judd. We really appreciate your time, and we look forward to talking to you again in the future.
My pleasure. Anytime, guys.
Thank you, Judd. Appreciate it.
Yeah, that was a good one. I enjoyed that, guys.
I guess I want to go on record and just say that we have to understand that this spiritual warfare is all around us all the time. Things like Halloween are something that we have to look in the mirror. We have to say, hey, is this affecting me? Is this one of those things that are we letting something evil in? Is it something that we shouldn't participate in? Just as Miss Krabs did, she tried to do something for the right reason, and it may have been great for that neighborhood and for those people because she took those people away from the vandalism and things to got them together to be part of a community. But at the same time, there is a fine line there. But I'm not saying that anything is wrong. If you take your kids trick-or-treating or if you go and do something of that nature, I'm not saying those things are wrong, but you have to make that decision. You have to understand whether you believe that's affecting you in a negative way. Is that something demonic that you're letting in your life? Is there something that is negatively impacting you? But we're never here to condemn. We're only here to kind of shed some light on things. So appreciate everybody listening. Love your time that you take to listen to us babble on and actually just come to listen to amazing people like Judd. But as a whole, we just really want to say, read your Bible, be in your Bible, and make God's word part of your everyday life, because that's the best way to have that discernment to make the right choices. Thanks.
Yeah. And I think too, knowing is half the battle. You know what I mean? Knowing and intent. So now you know, and if you do these things, and now that you do know, you can be on the spiritual watch, so to speak. And when you see some things that don't look right or sit right with you or the Holy Spirit, then you know to avoid those things and stay away from them now that you know. But like you said, it's a matter of intent, a matter of the heart, and that's all on you and between you and the Lord.
Thanks, guys. Keep on digging.
We thank you for listening to the Dig Bible Podcast. Questions, comments, or future episode ideas? We'd love to hear from you at thedig423@gmail.com. If you enjoy our content, don't forget to share, subscribe, and check out our Facebook group at the Dig Podcast. Remember, you can't lean on a shovel and pray for a hole. You gotta dig.